Councillor Siri Carney.
I'm curious to know what you're going to ask.
It's similar to,
I'm going to be slightly different. So first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us this morning. I think this has been hugely educational. I am old enough as an Irish person to remember a time in our society when being gay was illegal, and we have taken such a human rights societal change that in my lifetime we've gone to a place where I stand up and argue for same-sex couples' parenting rights. So, and that is a really welcome, fantastic growth in our society of inclusion. So I suppose I have that in my head of thinking societal change is very possible in Ireland and can be argued and can be brought in, and there's no question but that. So I approach this with that same view. However, I find myself in very conservative territory. And so I'm challenging my own conservatism, I suppose. We have a health research board within our Department of Health that produces figures that demonstrate that drug use is the same across all sectors of society. It's just maybe different drugs are used. So if you go to the more affluent end of our society, you're dealing with probably cocaine use, where there is problematic usage, it can be better covered up, it can be paid for with private treatment, and it's more socially acceptable. Then you come to socially deprived areas of our community, and the access, the drugs that are used are less socially palatable, let's say, from a perspective of opioids, and then the association of crime and access, high levels of crime. So I am completely 100% already there that we need to decriminalise the individual. We need to steer people on a pathway of health over anything else. I see it in vulnerable communities where the instant criminalisation of possession does no use. It is an absolute failure. But I suppose I'm wondering about a future where we take the brave step of regulation. So I'm completely there on decriminalisation. I'm curious, I want to push myself towards regulation. What would that look like? How would we get there? I don't want to say that we should arrive at a stage where all of our social services, our youth work, our investment in socially deprived areas has to reach X bar and have those outcomes before we could even consider regulation, though the sensible and the fear for communities to be exploited puts me at that place of saying, well, we would need to show a lowering of poverty, because in those societies, vulnerable families are exploited. Single parents have their children exploited as drug mules. The loophole or the correct attitude of our criminal justice system is, if you're under 18, you shouldn't carry a criminal record into your adulthood, and so that's exploited by drug gangs in the use of children in the whole dissemination of drugs. So I suppose I'm trying to get my head around, and I'm sorry I'm not as eloquent and as far down the road as my colleagues on this community are on this committee, but just trying to get my head around the stages that bring us to a place where we'd regulate. And at the same time then I see they've regulated in New York, and from a place that I would have once enjoyed going to, my most recent experience of going to New York was one that I would never want to repeat, where a father and mother and an 8-year-old child are approached on the streets constantly to sell cannabis. The smell of cannabis on the streets is just incredible. So that makes me think, oh, well, now I certainly don't want to go down that route. So I don't know, help me in moving myself to that place. And I'm sorry, I've talked too long, but I'm just trying to articulate it.
I think it's well articulated, and I think maybe if I go to Cassia Forst and maybe to maybe throw a hint, I suppose, at, you know, regulation, but also looking at those other areas about open air drug use and how many different things can, I suppose, be regulated within a regulation.
It just feels like such a matrix that we can't get under the bonnet of, and I just find that difficult.
You're on mute, Cassia.
Yes, a couple of quick thoughts. And I raised my hand because New York is my home at the moment. So I'm happy to speak to that. So there's a reason why cannabis goes first. And the reason why cannabis goes first is because it is the most used drug, most frequently used drugs. If you look at sort of the scale of drug use across the world, across the country, cannabis takes the primacy. And you can learn from experiences of others. I would look at Canada. I would look at a couple of states of the United States. So cannabis, we have so many examples. And, you know, there may be, as Marie earlier mentioned, you may want to consider social clubs rather than the full regulated market. Now, there's also a reason why heroin is made available by the government in Switzerland and in Germany and other countries, because that's a drug that causes overdoses and may potentially cause death. So I would say that the two drugs to start with are cannabis and heroin through medical prescribing, for those reasons. Now, New York. You know, I'm a little concerned that this is how people see New York, partially because if people went to New York, San Francisco, Oregon, and a couple of other states, they would have had probably somewhat similar experience. I'm not sure that New York is really the worst, but maybe that's my hopeful perception, because that's my home. Now, New York has struggled with the fact that it tried to regulate cannabis in a very specific way. It took a very long time to set up actually models of regulation that are social justice aware. And two, New York made a very conscious effort just to stop arrests. They felt like, so even if people are selling illegally, they made a choice as the city to stop arrests and stop harassment of people. I actually think that you should ask those questions of New York and state regulators, why they've made that choice, and maybe you wouldn't make that choice. Maybe you would have, you would have dispensaries and shops, and actually still continue arresting people outside. But for numerous reasons, some of them having to do with social justice and race, actually, New York had made that choice. And there's sort of two ways to understand it. But again, I want to say that there's now a lot of fantastic experience. And if you are taking that path, I would strongly suggest, we're very happy at OSF to host you in the US, invite you to a couple of states where they have different approaches, and make a judgment that would work for you.
Thank you. We'll request that the committee funds us visiting all the states, just so we can...
I'm up for that.
Just so we can be fair and we can redeem New York's reputation. I think that would be good. If there's anyone else want to come in on that, we don't have much time, but we can, I suppose, loop Ms. Nougier very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly, just to say that there's 2 points. So one of them is obviously legal regulation will not solve poverty issues. I think we should be very clear about what decriminalization can achieve, what legal regulation can achieve, and obviously, you know, state services, funding, access to education, access to services. This is, you know, operating like legal regulation will operate within these state, you know, policies as well. So legal regulation will not be able to sort out all poverty, but it will be able to remove certain layers of criminalization and vulnerabilization, I don't know if that's a word, vulnerabilities that are faced by some of the most marginalized populations. And secondly, there already exists a market. It's illegal, but the market exists. And I think we need to face that reality. So it's really important to also consider the power dynamics that operate within these illegal markets and see how we can redress some of the violence or oppressions or, you know, inequalities, whether it's class, gender, race inequalities and make sure that we address these within the legal market, because that's not a given. It requires serious thinking, and that's what Kasia was saying with the state of New York and Massachusetts and Oregon and other examples. Like, we need to kind of understand these and see how we don't perpetuate these problems of these issues basically in the legal environment. So I think this requires a lot of thinking. It's complicated, and that's where you really need to engage with the affected communities to really understand what their issues are and how the state can actually redress them adequately.